Senior guildsmen usually prefer to sit in the comfort of the office and let the apprentices do the hard work down in the heat and fumes. But here was Valentine pulling off his black robes, cupping a pen into the pocket of his waistcoat, pausing to grin at Tom from the doorway. "Come along, then," he said. "The sooner we start, the sooner we can be off to join the fun in Kensington Gardens." Down they went, and down, with Dog and Catherine following, down past the warehouse and on down twisting spirals of metal stairs to the digestion yards, where Salthook was growing smaller by the minute. All that remained of it now was a steel skeleton, and the machines were ripping even that apart, dragging deck plates and girders away to the furnaces to be melted down. Meanwhile, mountains of brick and slate and timber and salt and coal were trundling off on conveyor belts toward the heart of the gut, and skips of furniture and provisions were being wheeled clear by the salvage gangs. The salvage men were the true rulers of this part of London, and they knew it. They swaggered along the narrow walkways with the agility of tomcats, their bare chests shiny with sweat and their eyes hidden by tinted goggles. Tom had always been frightened of them, but Valentine hailed them with an easy charm and asked them if they had seen anything amongst the spoils that might be of interest to the museum. Sometimes he stopped to joke with them, or asked them how their families were doing, and he was always careful to introduce them to my colleague, Mr. Natsworthy. Tom felt himself swell with pride. Valentine was treating him like a grown-up, and so the salvagemen treated him the same way, touching the peaks of their greasy caps and grinning as they introduced themselves. They all seemed to be called Len or Schmudger. "Take no notice of what they say about these chaps up at the museum," warned Valentine, as one of the Lens led them to a skip where some antiques had been stowed. "Just because they live down in the nether burrows and don't pronounce their H's doesn't mean they're fools. That's why I like to come down in person when the yards are working. I've often seen salvage men and scavengers turn up artifacts that historians might have missed." "Yes, sir," agreed Tom, glancing at Catherine. He longed to do something that would impress the head historian and his beautiful daughter. If only he could find some wonderful fragment of old tech amongst all this junk, something that would make them remember him after they had gone back to the luxury of high London. Otherwise, after this wander around the yards, he might never see them again. Hoping to amaze them, he hurried to the skip and looked inside. After all, old tech did turn up from time to time in small-town antique shops, or on old ladies' mantelpieces. Imagine being the one to rediscover some legendary secret, like heavier-than-air flying machines or pot noodles. Even if it wasn't something that the Guild of Engineers could use, it might still end up in the museum, labeled and preserved in the display case with a notice saying, "Discovered by Mr. T. Natsworthy." He peered hopefully at the heap of salvage in the skip, shards of plastic, lampstands, a flattened toy ground car. A small metal box caught his eye. When he pulled it out and opened it, his own face blinked back at him, reflected in a silvery plastic disc. "Mr. Valentine, look, a CD." Valentine reached into the box and lifted out the disc, tilting it so that rainbow light darted across its surface. "Quite right," he said. "The ancients used these in their computers as a way of storing information." "Could it be important?" asked Tom. Valentine shook his head. "I'm sorry, Thomas. The people of the old days may have only lived in static settlements, but their electronic machines were far beyond anything London's engineers have been able to build. Even if there is still something stored on this disk, we have no way of reading it. But if it's a good find, keep hold of it, just in case." He turned away as Tom put the CD back in its box and slid into his pocket. But Catherine must have sensed Tom's disappointment, because she touched his hand and said, "It's lovely, Tom. Anything that survived all those thousands of years is lovely, whether it's any use to the horrible Guild of Engineers or not. I've got a necklace made of old computer disks." She smiled at him. She was as lovely as one of the girls in his daydreams, but kinder and funnier. And he knew that from now on, the heroines he rescued in his imagination would all be Catherine Valentine. There was nothing else of interest in the skip. Salthook had been a practical sort of town, too busy gnawing at the old seabed to bother about digging up the past. But instead of going straight back to the warehouse, Valentine led his companions up another staircase and along a narrow catwalk to the incomer station, where the former inhabitants were queuing to give their names to the clerk of admissions and be taken up to new homes in the hostels and workhouses of London. Even when I'm not on duty, he explained, I always make a point of going down to see the scavengers when we make a catch, before they have a chance to see us sell their finds at the Tier 5 antique markets, and melt back into the out-country. There were always some scavengers aboard a catch, townless wanderers who roamed the hunting ground on foot, scratching at pieces of old tech. Salt Hook was no exception. At the end of a long queue of dejected townsfolk stood a group more ragged than the rest, with long tattered coats that hung down to their ankles and goggles and dust masks slung about their grubby necks. Like most Londoners, Tom was horrified by the idea that people still actually lived on the bare earth. He hung back with Catherine and Dog, but Valentine went over to speak with the scavengers. They came clustering around him, all except one, a tall, thin one in a black coat. A girl, Tom thought, although he could not be sure, because she wore a black scarf wrapped across her face like the turban of a desert nomad. He stood near her and watched while Valentine introduced himself to the other scavengers and asked, So, have any of you found anything the historians guild might wish to purchase? Some of the men nodded, some shook their heads, some rummaged in their bulging packs. The girl in the black headscarf slid one hand inside her coat and said, I have something for you, Valentine. She spoke so softly that only Tom and Catherine heard her, and as they turned to look, she suddenly sprang forward, whipping out a long, thin-bladed knife.